August 1944. 300,000 German prisoners of war stepped off trains in America expecting punishment, starvation, maybe execution, just like they'd been told by Nazi propaganda. Instead, they walked into American factories and saw something so shocking, so impossibly abundant, that hardened Wehrmacht officers broke down and wept, realizing in that moment that Germany had already lost the war. But what could possibly be so overwhelming in an American factory that it shattered a lifetime of indoctrination in a single afternoon? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. August 1944. The train rattled through Oklahoma farmland, carrying men who still couldn't believe they were alive. Hauptmann Werner Müller pressed his face against the dusty window and watched endless fields of wheat roll past under a merciless summer sun. Beside him, young Gefreiter Hans Becker kept touching his own ribs, as if checking that his body was still real. They were German prisoners of war, and everything they knew about the world was about to fall apart. Back home in Bavaria, Müller's mother was boiling potato peels for soup. His father stood in bread lines that stretched around city blocks. The ration cards allowed 3 pounds of bread per week when bread was available at all. Coffee came from roasted acorns. Butter was a memory. This was normal now. This was what total war meant. The radio told them Americans were suffering worse, that their mongrel society was crumbling, that German discipline and will would triumph over American chaos and weakness. Müller half believed it, even as Allied bombers turned German cities into moonscapes. The train lurched to a stop at Camp Gruber. Armed guards shouted in English for the prisoners to disembark. Müller climbed down, squinting in the Oklahoma heat, expecting wire fences and watchtowers and perhaps a beating or two. Instead, he saw something impossible. An American guard sat on a wooden crate eating a sandwich. White bread. Real bread, thick slices of it. Ham visible between the layers. The guard took 3 bites and threw the rest into a trash barrel. Just threw it away. Half a sandwich with real meat. Becker grabbed Müller's arm. "Did you see that? He threw it away. We haven't seen meat in 6 months, and he just threw it away?" They were marched through processing. The camp commandant, a bored-looking captain with a clipboard, announced through an interpreter that prisoners would be assigned to work programs. The Geneva Convention guaranteed humane treatment. They would labor in American factories producing aircraft. They would be paid 80 cents per day. They would receive the same food as American workers. Müller trusted none of it. This had to be theater, a propaganda show designed to break their spirits, make them think Germany was losing, make them doubt the cause. He'd seen propaganda before. He knew how it worked. But that night, lying on a clean cot with actual blankets, staring through the barracks window, Müller saw something that planted the first seed of doubt. Beyond the camp fence sat a parking lot, not for military vehicles, for civilian cars, dozens of them, maybe 100. Workers from the nearby factory, the guard explained. Regular American workers who built airplanes, and they all owned automobiles. Müller had never owned a car. His father, a respectable civil servant, had never owned a car. In all of Munich, perhaps one family in 50 owned a car. And here, factory workers parked 100 of them outside their workplace like bicycles. He closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. A question burned in his mind, terrible and insistent. What if everything they told us was a lie? What if we never understood what we were really fighting? Tomorrow, he would find out. The bus ride to the Douglas Aircraft Factory took 20 minutes through Tulsa's morning streets. Müller watched ordinary houses pass by, each with a front lawn, many with cars in the driveway. Children played on sidewalks. Women pushed baby carriages. Nobody looked hungry. Nobody looked afraid. The America he'd been told about was supposed to be a land of gangsters and breadlines, of racial chaos and industrial collapse. But these streets looked clean and calm and impossibly normal. The bus turned a corner and the factory appeared. Muller's breath caught in his throat. The building stretched across the horizon like a metal cathedral, longer than 3 city blocks, walls of corrugated steel rising 5 stories high. Smokestacks punctured the sky. The hum of machinery vibrated through the bus windows even before they stopped. This was just one factory, one single factory in one ordinary Oklahoma City. Inside, the noise hit like a physical force. The main assembly hall was vast enough to swallow a dozen German factories whole. The ceiling disappeared into shadows and steel rafters. Electric lights blazed everywhere, bright as daylight, no rationing here. And the aircraft, dear God, the aircraft. Not one precious plane being assembled by master craftsmen, but dozens of them in various stages of completion, stretched along an assembly line that seemed to have no end. Muller counted fuselages. 10, 15, 20. He stopped counting. An American supervisor approached, a man in his 40s with rolled-up sleeves and a clipboard. He spoke through an interpreter, assigning workstations. Muller and 5 other prisoners were directed to a riveting station on a B-17 fuselage section. The supervisor demonstrated the pneumatic riveting gun, a tool that drove rivets in seconds with compressed air. Rat-tat-tat-tat. 4 rivets in the time it took a German worker to hammer one by hand. The supervisor handed Muller the gun. Just like this, keep the pressure steady, the gun does the work. Muller took the tool, feeling its weight, its power humming through his hands. Back home, aircraft assembly required skilled metal workers trained for years. Each plane was a work of art, crafted with precision and pride, but also slowly. So slowly. He'd toured the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg once, watching talented men spend hours on single components. Here, the Americans had broken everything into simple steps. This man rivets. That woman installs wiring. This team fits the frame. That team adds the skin. No single person needed to understand the whole aircraft. The system understood. The process was understood. He pressed the trigger. The gun roared. 4 perfect rivets in 4 seconds. He looked at the supervisor, who gave him a thumbs up and walked away to help someone else. Just walked away. No hovering, no suspicion. Mueller was a German prisoner, and they just handed him a power tool and trusted him to do the job. Beside him, Becker struggled with a drill press. An American worker noticed a young black man in coveralls. He came over and showed Becker the correct angle, how to let the machine do the work instead of forcing it. Becker nodded, tried again, succeeded. The black man clapped him on the shoulder and returned to his own station. Mueller's mind reeled. In Nazi Germany, this black man would be considered subhuman, unfit even to live, let alone work skilled labor. Yet here he operated complex machinery, earned wages, taught skills to others, and did it all with casual competence. The propaganda called Americans mongrels, weakened by race mixing. But Mueller saw only efficiency, saw only production. The race of the worker didn't matter. The work mattered. The output mattered. 2 hours into the shift, Mueller had riveted more fuselage sections than he thought possible. The rhythm became automatic. Position, press, move, repeat. Around him, the factory roared with productivity. Women worked alongside men at welding stations, their torch flames bright as stars. An older white man supervised a team of younger workers, black and white together, checking quality control. Nobody seemed to care about race or gender or anything except the work itself. This was the chaos and weakness Nazi propaganda promised? Was industrial inferiority? A whistle blew at noon. The machinery wound down. Workers set aside their tools and headed toward a set of double doors. The supervisor gestured for the prisoners to follow. "Lunch," the interpreter said, 30 minutes. They walked into a cafeteria that made Mueller stop in his tracks. The room held 100 long tables with benches. Along one wall stood a serving line with metal trays and sections for different foods. But it was the smell that hit him first. Fried chicken. His mouth watered instantly. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smelled meat cooking. Real meat, not the mystery sausage made from sawdust and hope that German rations provided. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The line moved forward. A woman in a white apron and hairnet stood behind the counter with a smile, an actual smile. She loaded a plate with 2 pieces of fried chicken, a mound of mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans with bits of bacon, a square of cornbread, and a small bowl of fruit cocktail with cherries. She set it on Mueller's tray and gestured to the drinks. Coffee, milk, water, all free, all unlimited. Mueller stood frozen. The woman said something in English. The interpreter translated. She says to take as much as you want. You can come back for seconds if you're still hungry. Becker, behind him in line, whispered in German. This can't be real. This has to be a show, for us, to break us. But Mueller watched the American workers loading identical plates. I watched them laugh and joke as they took their food. Watched a thin young man go back for a 3rd piece of chicken and nobody stopped him. This wasn't a show. This was ordinary. This was Wednesday lunch at an aircraft factory in Oklahoma. They sat at a table near the back, the group of German prisoners together, and ate in silence. The chicken was hot and crispy, the meat falling off the bone. The mashed potatoes were real potatoes, not the turnip paste they'd eaten for 2 years. The butter was actual butter, yellow and rich. Mueller ate slowly, making each bite last, but his stomach cramped from the richness after months of thin soup and hard bread. Across the table, Becker had tears running down his face. He wasn't sobbing, just eating and crying silently, stuffing his mouth with food he'd forgotten existed. A young prisoner named Klaus stared at his plate like it might disappear if he looked away. Another man, Friedrich, ate mechanically, his face blank with shock. An American worker at the next table noticed them and came over, an older man with gray hair and a kind face. He spoke to the interpreter. Tell them welcome. Tell them the food is always this good. My wife packs me a lunch sometimes, but honestly, the factory food is better. He grinned and went back to his table. After lunch, a refrigerated truck pulled up outside the factory. Workers cheered. The supervisor announced something and people lined up at the back of the truck. The interpreter explained. Coca-Cola delivery. The company provides cold drinks in the afternoon, 2 per worker. Mueller had heard of Coca-Cola. Propaganda called it Jewish decadence, American poison, a symbol of everything wrong with their culture. He watched workers grab bottles from crates of ice, watched them pop the caps and drink deeply, watched them sigh with satisfaction. The supervisor handed him a bottle, ice cold and wet with condensation. The glass felt like holding winter in his hand. He twisted off the cap, the fizz and pop. He raised the bottle and drank. The carbonation burned his throat in the best way. The sweetness exploded across his tongue. The coldness shocked his teeth. It was unlike anything he'd ever tasted. This combination of sugar and fizz and cold, this casual luxury given away for free on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of a war. Becker held his bottle like a religious artifact. He drank half in one long swallow, then stopped and looked at Mueller with wide eyes. They give this away? Every day. They just give it away. Mueller saved his bottle cap, slipping it into his pocket. Physical proof. Something to hold, something to remember when he doubted his memories later. The afternoon shift passed in a blur of rivets and noise and profound disorientation. Mueller's hands worked automatically, while his mind struggled to process everything. The abundance wasn't just in the food or the drinks, it was in everything. The electric lights that never dimmed, the tools that never broke, the raw materials that kept arriving in endless supply. There was no rationing here, no making do, no improvising with scraps. The Americans simply had what they needed, and when they ran out, more appeared. He watched a worker accidentally drop a wrench into the machinery. The man said something that sounded like a curse, retrieved a new wrench from a tool crib that held hundreds of wrenches, and returned to work. In Germany, that lost wrench would have meant paperwork and explanations and possible punishment. Here, it meant nothing. Tools were as common as air. At one point, Mueller saw something that made his hands still on the rivet gun. A woman, perhaps 30 years old, was welding part of an engine mount. Her torch work was precise and confident. She finished a seam, lifted her mask, and lit a cigarette. She smoked while examining her work, then nodded in satisfaction and moved to the next piece. A woman, smoking, working skilled labor, making decisions about quality control. In Germany, women were for children and church and kitchen. Here, they built bombers. The supervisor came by to check Mueller's work. He examined the rivets, ran his hand over the seams, and nodded approval. "Good work," he said in English. Mueller understood the tone, if not the words. Pride flickered in his chest before shame crushed it. He was doing good work, for the enemy, building the very planes that bombed his homeland. But what did homeland mean anymore? What did any of it mean? Near the end of the shift, Mueller noticed something else. The black worker who'd helped Becker earlier was now training a white woman on a new drill press technique. She listened carefully, tried it, succeeded, and they both smiled. The casual equality of it struck Mueller like a hammer. Nazi ideology said races couldn't work together, that hierarchy was natural and necessary. But here was proof otherwise. Here was functioning chaos. Here was strength through diversity, not purity. The final whistle blew at 5 o'clock. The machinery wound down for the day shift. Workers cleaned their stations, put away tools, and headed for the exits. Mueller and the other prisoners were escorted back to the bus. As they left the factory floor, Mueller looked back one more time at the assembly line. Tomorrow, those same stations will produce more aircraft, and the day after, and the day after. An endless stream of bombers, fighters, transport planes. America wasn't just fighting a war, it was a manufacturing victory. On the bus ride back to camp, nobody spoke. What was there to say? They'd been told America was weak. They'd been told American workers were lazy and American industry was inferior. They'd been told that German engineering and German will would triumph over American materialism. But lies can't survive contact with truth. And the truth was that America produced more in one factory than Germany produced in 10. The truth was that American workers ate better as prisoners than German soldiers ate on active duty. The truth was that abundance, not scarcity, was the foundation of real power. Back in the barracks that evening, some prisoners refused to accept it. "It's propaganda," insisted a sergeant named Dietrich. "They're showing us only what they want us to see. This is theater." But Mueller shook his head. Theater for whom? There were 500 workers in that factory. You think they're all actors? You think those machines are fake? You think the food was cardboard? He pulled out the Coca-Cola bottle cap. "This is real. Everything we saw was real. And that's what scares you. Because if this is real, then what else were we lying about?" Dietrich had no answer. Nobody did. They lay on their cots as twilight fell over Oklahoma, and each man wrestled with the same terrible question. If America was this strong, this productive, this abundant, what chance would Germany ever have? The war wasn't lost on battlefields. It was lost before it began. In the factories and fields and fundamental assumptions about what made a nation powerful. Mueller closed his eyes and saw again the endless assembly line, the casual waste, the refrigerated truck full of cold drinks on a hot afternoon. He saw the woman welding, the black man teaching, the supervisor who trusted prisoners with power tools. He saw abundance where he'd been promised scarcity. He saw efficiency where he'd been promised chaos. He saw the future, and Germany wasn't in it. Not this Germany. Not the Germany of blood and soil and racial purity and iron will. That Germany was already dead. I just didn't know it yet. Tomorrow he will return to the factory, and the day after. And slowly, rivet by rivet, meal by meal, cold drink by cold drink, everything he believed would continue to crumble. The propaganda couldn't survive this. No ideology could. You can't argue with a full stomach. You can't debate industrial capacity. You can't philosophize away the simple fact that the enemy feeds you better than your own country ever did. The transformation had begun, and there was no going back. November 23, 1944, Thanksgiving Day. The word meant nothing to Mueller until the camp commander explained through the interpreter that it was an American holiday, a day of gratitude and feasting, and that prisoners would receive a traditional meal in accordance with the Geneva Convention and American custom. Mueller expected something slightly better than usual, perhaps an extra portion of meat, maybe real coffee instead of the ersatz kind. What arrived in the mess hall that afternoon destroyed the last walls around his heart. The tables had been covered with white cloths, real tablecloths, clean and pressed. Plates were set with actual silverware, not the tin cups and spoons they usually used. And then came the food. Whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening, carried on platters by kitchen staff who smiled as they worked. Mountains of mashed potatoes, bowls of dark gravy, stuffing that smelled of sage and butter, cranberry sauce, bright red and sweet, green bean casserole. Dinner rolls were so soft and white they looked like clouds. And at the end of each table, whole pumpkin pies topped with whipped cream. Mueller sat down and stared at his plate. More food sat in front of him than his entire family had seen in 6 months. His mother was eating turnip soup in a cold apartment in Bavaria. His sister was thin as a rail, her ration card barely providing enough bread to survive. His father stood in endless lines, hoping for a bit of lard or a scrap of meat. And here, Mueller the prisoner, Mueller the enemy, had a feast laid before him that would feed his family for a week. The American chaplain stood and offered a prayer. Mueller didn't understand all the English words, but he caught some of them. Thanks, peace, hope, reconciliation. The chaplain's voice was gentle, not triumphant. He prayed for the war to end, for soldiers on both sides to return home, for healing and forgiveness. When he finished, he said, "Amen," and the room echoed it back. Mueller picked up his fork. His hand shook. He cut into the turkey. The meat was moist and tender, not the tough, stringy fowl he remembered from before the war. He took a bite. The flavor exploded across his tongue, rich and savory. He added mashed potatoes. Real butter melted into them. He tried the stuffing, the cranberry sauce, the green beans. Each bite was a small death to everything he'd believed. Across the table, Becker was crying again. Not ashamed tears this time, but something deeper. He ate and wept openly, and nobody mocked him for it. Klaus, the young prisoner, had stopped eating entirely. He just stared at his plate, overwhelmed. Friedrich ate mechanically, methodically, as if trying to absorb not just the food, but the meaning behind it. An American officer walked among the tables, checking that everyone had enough. He stopped at their table and asked through the interpreter if everything was satisfactory. Mueller looked up at him, this enemy officer, and couldn't find words. Finally, he managed, "Why?" The interpreter translated. The officer looked confused. Why what? Why this? We are prisoners. We are enemy. Why you give us this? The officer thought for a moment, then spoke slowly so the interpreter could follow. Because it's Thanksgiving. Because you're far from home. Because the war won't last forever. And when it's over, we'll need to remember we're all human beings. He nodded and moved to the next table. Mueller sat down his fork. The food became difficult to swallow, not because it wasn't delicious, but because each bite carried the weight of revelation. Germany fed its soldiers on promises and propaganda. America fed its prisoners on turkey and kindness. Germany said sacrifice made you strong. America showed that abundance made you stronger. Germany demanded everything and gave nothing back. America asked little and gave much. That night, alone in his bunk, Mueller wrote in the small journal he'd been allowed to keep. His hand moved across the page in the dim light, the German words flowing like a confession. November 23, 1944. Today I understood we have lost. Not because of military defeat, though that will come. We have lost because we never understood what we were fighting. America is not weak because it is kind. It is strong because it is abundant. They feed us, their enemies, better than our government fed us as soldiers. They produce more in one factory than we do in 10. And they do this while their men joke, their women work freely, their Negroes are paid wages. I believed in German discipline. I believed in German precision. I believed in German will. But what is will against a nation that has surplus? We were told sacrifice made us strong, but I see now it only made us hungry. It made us small. It made us cruel. We confused suffering with virtue and called our poverty strength. But strength is feeding your prisoners turkey on a November afternoon. Strength is trusting your workers regardless of their skin. Strength is having so much you can be generous. We had nothing, so we took. They have everything, so they give. This is the difference. This is why we lost before we even began. He closed the journal and lay back on his cot. Through the barracks window, stars shone cold and bright over Oklahoma. The same stars that shone over Bavaria, over Hamburg, over Berlin. But they looked different now. Everything looked different. 2 weeks later, Mueller was assigned to a repair detail in Tulsa. They were fixing a damaged fence near a residential neighborhood, escorted by a single guard who mostly sat and read a magazine. A woman came out of a nearby house carrying a tray. She was perhaps 50 years old, with gray hair and a kind face. On the tray were glasses of lemonade and a plate of cookies. She set the tray down on a fence post and gestured for the prisoners to help themselves. Through broken English and hand gestures, she communicated that it was hot and they must be thirsty. Mueller took a glass. The lemonade was cold and sweet and perfect. He said, "Thank you," in careful English. The woman smiled. Then she said something that made the guard translate. Her son is fighting in Europe. She knows you're German prisoners. She wants you to know you're welcome to the lemonade anyway. Mueller stared at her. Her son might be facing German soldiers at this very moment, might be killing them or being killed by them. And yet she brought them lemonade and cookies. He managed to ask, through the guard, "Why do you give enemy food?" She looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "You're not my enemy, son. You're just a boy far from home. My Billy is too." Mueller's vision blurred. He set down the lemonade glass because his hands were shaking too hard to hold it. This woman, with her son in danger, this enemy civilian, showed him more humanity than his own government ever had. She saw him not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a human being to be fed. This casual, simple kindness broke something in him that all the factory tours and holiday meals had only cracked. That night, he wept. Not from sadness, from shame. Shame at what he'd believed. Shame at what Germany had become. Shame at the lies he'd swallowed and repeated. But also something else. Something like relief. Because if he could see the lies now, maybe he could find the truth. Maybe this terrible clarity was the beginning of something better. The camp offered English classes twice a week. Mueller signed up. Becker joined him. They sat in a classroom with other prisoners and learned verbs and nouns and sentence structure. But they learned more than language. The American teacher, a retired professor, taught them about the Constitution, about rights and laws, about government by consent rather than force. She explained how American democracy worked, its checks and balances, its messy arguments and compromises. Mueller compared it to the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle that said one man's will was law. He thought about power that came from the people versus power that came from force. He thought about systems that trusted citizens versus systems that controlled them. And slowly, day by day, English word by English word, his mind rebuilt itself on new foundations. The transformation was complete. He'd entered America as a German soldier. He would leave as something else entirely. Not an American, but no longer the German he'd been. Something new, something undefined. Someone who'd seen both worlds and could never know what he'd learned. June 1946. The war had been over for more than a year, but only now were the last prisoners being sent home. Mueller stood on the deck of a transport ship in New York Harbor, his small bag of possessions at his feet. Inside the bag, an English-German dictionary, photographs of American friends from the factory, letters from Mrs. Patterson who'd brought them lemonade, and a single Coca-Cola bottle cap wrapped carefully in cloth. Also inside his bag, invisible but heavier than everything else, was a completely changed mind. The Statue of Liberty rose green and enormous against the morning sky. Mueller had learned what it meant during his English classes. Liberty enlightens the world. A gift from France. A symbol of freedom and welcome. He stared at it until the ship turned and the statue disappeared behind buildings and fog. He wondered if he would ever see America again. He wondered if Germany would ever build something that welcomed the world instead of conquering it. Becker stood beside him at the rail. They'd become friends during 2 years of captivity, though they rarely spoke about what they'd learned. Some things were too big for words. Becker was returning to the Ruhr region, to whatever remained of his industrial town. Mueller was going back to Bavaria, to Munich, to a family he hadn't seen in 3 years. Neither knew what they would find. The letters from home had been few and carefully worded, but the message was clear. Germany was destroyed, utterly destroyed. The ship docked in Hamburg 2 weeks later. Mueller's first sight of Germany was rubble. The harbor was half destroyed, twisted metal and sunken ships visible in the water. The city beyond was a landscape of broken buildings and empty windows. 60% of Hamburg had been bombed into dust. The remaining 40% looked like teeth in an old man's mouth, scattered and broken. They were processed through a refugee center, given papers, and released. Mueller walked through Hamburg's streets in a daze. He'd known about the bombing from newsreels the Americans had shown them. But knowing and seeing were different things. Entire blocks were gone. Children played in rubble piles. Women with hollow faces stood in lines for ration cards. Old men pushed carts of salvaged wood. The smell of ash and despair hung over everything. The train to Munich took 12 hours because so many tracks were damaged. Mueller stared out the window at his country. Destroyed bridges, burned forests, abandoned tanks rusting in fields. Towns reduced to shells. This was the 1,000-year Reich. This was the glorious future they'd been promised. Rubble and ashes and defeated people shuffling through ruins. Munich was no better, perhaps worse, because he'd known these streets as a child. The street where he'd bought bread was gone. The school he attended was a pile of bricks. The park where he'd played was a crater. He walked for an hour before finding his family's apartment building. It stood, damaged but standing, one wall blackened by fire but the structure intact. His mother opened the door and screamed. She grabbed him and held him and wept into his chest. She'd grown so thin. He could feel her bones through her dress. His father appeared behind her, moving slowly like an old man, though he was only 55. His sister Greta came from the kitchen, eyes wide with disbelief. They pulled him inside, and the questions came in a flood. Where had he been? What had happened? Was he hurt? Had they treated him well? Mueller set down his bag and looked at his family. Really looked at them. Thin, exhausted. His mother's hair had gone completely gray. His father's uniform jacket, which he still wore from habit, hung loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds. Greta, who'd been 17 when he left, looked 40. Hunger did that. Defeat did that. They fed him what they had: turnip soup, a slice of dark bread made from potatoes and sawdust, ersatz coffee that tasted like dirt. His mother apologized for the meager meal, tears in her eyes. "The rations are so small now, we're lucky to have this much." Mueller ate slowly, his stomach turning. 2 years of American food had spoiled him for this. But he said nothing. What could he say? That his enemies had fed him better? That he'd eaten turkey and pie while his family starved? The truth would sound like betrayal. That evening, his father wanted to talk about the war, about betrayal and conspiracy, about how Germany had been stabbed in the back again, just like in 1918, about how they'd fought honorably but been overwhelmed by numbers. The same lies, the same excuses, the same refusal to see the truth. Mueller listened for an hour before he couldn't stay silent anymore. "No, Vater, we weren't betrayed. We were lied to, and we believed the lies." His father's face darkened. "What are you saying?" Mueller opened his bag. He pulled out the photographs. The American factory with its assembly line stretching to the horizon. The cafeteria with its abundant food. The parking lot full of workers' cars. He spread them on the table like evidence in a trial. "This is what I saw in America. This is what we were fighting." His mother picked up a photograph, studying it with confusion. "This can't be real. This must be propaganda." "It's real, Mutter. All of it. They had so much they gave it away. They fed us, their prisoners, better than our own government ever fed us as soldiers." He pulled out the work papers showing his pay as a prisoner. American factory workers earned more in an hour than I earned in a day. And I earned more as a prisoner than most Germans earned as free workers. His father stood up, angry now. "You were fooled by their wealth. They bought you with comfort. This is exactly what the Führer warned us about, this American materialism, this weakness." Mueller felt something break inside him. Not collapse, break open. He reached into his bag and pulled out the Coca-Cola bottle cap, holding it up in the lamplight. "They gave this to us, every day, free. This small thing. They had so much, they gave it to their enemies. That's not a weakness, Vater. That's strength, real strength. Not the strength to suffer, but the strength to end suffering." The room fell silent. Greta reached across the table and took the bottle cap from his hand, turning it over, examining it like an artifact from another world, which it was. Over the following weeks, Mueller tried to explain what he'd learned. Some refused to listen. His father never accepted it, dying bitter 5 years later, still believing in the glorious cause that had destroyed his country. But others listened. Becker, back in the Ruhr, got a job in Reconstruction and started organizing workers, advocating for American-style labor unions, for dignity and negotiation instead of dictation. Klaus became a teacher. Friedrich opened a small business. All of them carried back the same truth. There was another way to live, a better way. Mueller used his English skills to get work as a translator, then as a teacher. He never hid his prisoner of war experience. When students asked about the war, he told them the truth. "I learned more about Germany in an American prison camp than I did in 12 years of Nazi schools. I learned that prosperity isn't theft, it's productivity. I learned that feeding your enemy doesn't make you weak, it makes you civilized." Years later, in the 1970s, a young journalist interviewed him for a documentary about German POWs. The journalist asked what he'd really learned in America. Mueller was old by then, his hair white, but his eyes were still sharp. He thought for a long moment before answering. "People ask me what I learned in America. I learned that abundance is not illusion. I learned that democracy is not chaos. I learned that strength comes not from what you can endure, but from what you can build. We were 300,000 German prisoners. We came home and told the truth. Some refused to believe us, but enough listened. Germany rebuilt itself not on the ashes of the Reich, but on the ideas we brought back from Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas. We learned that a nation that can feed its prisoners can feed the world, that a nation that trusts its people can build anything. I was captured as an enemy. I returned as a witness. And what I witnessed was simple. The future belongs not to those who can endure suffering, but to those who can end it. In 1985, Mueller returned to America for the first time since his repatriation. He visited Camp Gruber, now a historical site with a small museum. He walked the grounds where he'd been held prisoner. He found the marker commemorating the German POWs who'd passed through. From his pocket, he pulled out an old Coca-Cola bottle cap, worn smooth by 40 years of handling. He placed it carefully on the memorial plaque. A young park ranger asked what it meant. Mueller smiled. "It means I was a prisoner here, and here I learned to be free." He looked up at the vast Oklahoma sky, at the golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon, symbols of the abundance that had broken his chains and rebuilt his mind. Somewhere in Germany, his students were teaching their children about democracy and human rights. Somewhere in the Ruhr, Becker's Union was negotiating fair wages. Somewhere, the seeds they'd carried home had grown into something good. The war had ended 40 years ago, but its most important battle had been fought not on beaches or in cities, but in the hearts of men who'd seen two worlds and chosen the better one. That battle, Mueller knew, they had won. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.